Next on AMC, take a look at the career of a comic genius no longer exist. Now, AMC, a dedicated leader in film preservation, is proud to present a special collection of motion picture classics which might have been lost forever. Film Preservation Classics, hosted by one of Hollywood's legendary leading ladies, Lauren Bacall. See movies like A Streetcar Named Desire and A Place in the Sun, restored to their original splendor. Film Preservation Classics, Fridays at 10 p.m. Eastern, only on AMC.
Like it.
Some of these films haven't been seen in over 40 years.
A girl.
6 hours of the original Little Rascals for just $69.95. All proceeds from your order will benefit the Film Foundation in its ongoing effort to preserve our nation's vanishing film heritage.
My hero, make them
Call 1-800-AMC-3360 and order your exclusive film preservation collection today.
On screen, his deadpan demeanor was his trademark. He was Buster Keaton, and his stunts set the standard for hair-raising hilarity. Buster Keaton, a hard act to follow.
Coming up next, only on AMC.
Happy holidays and season's greetings from everyone at American Movie Classics.
Happy holidays!
When I was 6 months old, we're in some little town, small hotel, and I fell down a full flight of stairs at the bottom. They come running up. I sat up and just shook my head and shook it off and didn't cry. So they knew I wasn't hurt. And Houdini says, that was sure a buster, meaning a fall, because that's the only time it was used. It meant a bronco buster or a fall. It was never used as a name. My father said, well, that would be a good name for him. It don't sound bad.
Buster Keaton. They now call him a genius. Intellectual critics claim him as their own. Yet he never saw himself like that. No man can be a genius, he said, in slap shoes and a flat hat. Keaton had no formal education. He was a totally intuitive artist, most at home working on the mechanics of gags. Yet he had an astonishing understanding of the power of film. The big screen was his element, and on it he displayed a dazzling sense of cinema. Yet his roots were in vaudeville. He mocked the idea that he did everything himself. He always acknowledged his team, but the vision was his. It was in this house in Pequea, Kansas in 1895 that Joseph Keaton Jr. made his first appearance.
I was born with a tent show on a one-night stand in Kansas. My mother joined the show when I was 2 weeks old, and it was called the Keaton Houdini Medicine Show Company. Now, that's Harry Houdini, the handcuff king.
His father found Buster joining the act at 9 months, crawling on stage from the wings.
By the time I was 4 years old, I was a regular member of the act, wearing flap shoes and grotesque clothes with a bald-headed wig and Irish beard on. My dad was a comedian and a great eccentric dancer and tricks. He wasn't exactly an acrobat, but darn near. And my mother played musical instruments and danced with him. And of course, when I came into the act, then he got the idea of trying to show the audience how to bring up children correctly. And every time I did something he didn't like, he'd take me with the back of the neck and throw me through a piece of scenery. I grew up getting knocked around.
A child acrobat who knew Keaton was Charles Lamont.
In the finale of the act, they generally take Buster and throw him into the orchestra pit. And amongst the drums, the bass drum, the violins, or what have you, with a terrific sound of crash, and the audience ate it up.
That's where the abused child accusation comes in, which has been made against his father, and absolutely untrue. Absolutely untrue. Buster told me over and over again how much he enjoyed it, how he loved the act and the rough house.
There is no film of Keaton as a child, but in his comedies he'd use his childhood experiences and his father.
Naturally, it had to hurt Buster because, you know, he's flesh and blood, not a piece of wood. And he wasn't padded. But he had learned how to protect himself so he could avoid any serious damage to his person. So with him, I presume, it was like play.
I had learned at an early age that I happened to be the type of comedian that couldn't laugh at anything he was doing. I also learned that the more serious I took everything, and how serious life was in general, the better laughs I got.
Buster's parents were violating the child labor law. His mother educated him as best she could. He hardly ever went to school. He may only have been 5 years old, but he was now vital to the act. The three Keatons were hounded by the Gary Society, formed to stop the exploitation of children.
Most people, or a lot of people, thought he was a midget. And the Gary Society had to check it out. And this one official came backstage and took one look at this affair here, dressed and costumed and makeup exactly like his father, and he couldn't quite tell. So he said to one of the stagehands, he says, "How old is that guy?" And the stagehand was wise to the deal. So he pointed to Buster's mother and he says, "I don't know, you'll have to ask his wife."
As Buster grew up, Joe could no longer throw him around. Here Keaton recreates the act with Al St. John. Louise Dresser on the same bill remembers one particularly dangerous routine.
He used to stand on a table back of his father, whirling around a basketball on the end of a rope, while Joe was trying to shave himself with a straight-edged razor. The ball kept getting closer and closer and closer. All of a sudden, bang.
It was a very, very tough act, and it really was tough. Buzz told me that they were injured a good part of the time. Of course, by the time I saw it, his father had taken to booze so that the timing was a little bit off.
When he kicked over my head, he misjudged it, and the back of his kneecap caught me right there, back of the head. And I stiffened and went out and fell straight back. And he didn't realize what was wrong. And my head hit the floor first. I'm out 18 hours.
Two more children, Harry and Louise, and the three Keatons became the five Keatons. Buster was now the family's main support.
We didn't work in the summer. Our summer home was in Muskegon, Michigan. There's a whole actors' colony there.
Here he met many of his future collaborators. And to hear in 1917 his father returned, a confirmed alcoholic. Keaton had finally broken up the act. He was a veteran of the theatre at 21. In New York, one wet March afternoon in 1917, Keaton met another vaudeville comic. Roscoe Arbuckle now worked in the picture business. He had started as a Keystone Cop with comedy producer Max Sennett. He ranked second only to Chaplin in world popularity. Producer Joseph Schenck had tempted him away from Sennett with a huge salary and his own company. With complete creative control, Arbuckle directed his own films. He invited Keaton to the Talmadge Studios on 48th Street and changed his life.
The first time I ever walked on in front of a camera, I came in to buy a bucket full of molasses.
In this, his very first scene, Keaton instinctively used props as comedy material.
Yeah, he only had to turn me loose in the set and I'd have material in 2 minutes because I'd been doing it all my life.
Arbuckle and Keaton found an instant rapport. A simple gag of molasses turned into a classic sequence.
When I put my hat back on to leave and got the bucket of molasses, he tipped, says, good day, and I start, and the hat won't move. And I spilt molasses all over, I got my feet caught in them. Well, the first thing I did in the studio is to want to tear that camera to pieces. I had to know how that film got into the cutting room, what you did to it in there, and how you made things match, and how you finally got the picture together. I just watched Arbuckle do it, and that's all there was to it.
Arbuckle taught Keaton one of the few things he'd not experienced, how to take a sack of flour.
I said, how am I going to keep from flinching? He says, look away from me. When I say turn, it'll be there.
And it was, and you did it.
He put my head where my feet were.
On the next door set, the great dramatic actress Norma Talmadge was finding it increasingly difficult to work. She insisted the comedy unit depart. Joe Schenck, recently married to Norma, obligingly moved them uptown to the Biograph Studios in the Bronx. Keaton was now second string to Arbuckle with Al St. John. He also played many uncredited roles, revealed only by a close examination of the film.
I was only with Arbuckle about 3 pictures when I became his assistant director. I was the guy that sat alongside the camera and watched scenes that he was in, and ended up just practically co-directing with him.
The Arbuckle Company left for California in late 1917 in search of better backgrounds.
I didn't know it at the time, but I've turned out to be Arbuckle's whole writing staff for gags.
After 12 films, the war interrupted his career. But Keaton spent much of his time in France entertaining the troops. Back in California, missing his family, he gravitated towards another.
Oh, Buster, he was, well, the original man that came to dinner. My brother-in-law brought him home for dinner one night, and he stayed for 3 years. And, of course, Buster became one of the family. My mother was just, well, she was crazy about him. He was like a son to her, and wherever we moved, we figured on Buster. I think the extent of his wardrobe was a toothbrush, which he carried in his pocket. But he was a darling. He was a doll.
An important part of this family was Roscoe Arbuckle. To the end of his life, Keaton maintained that Arbuckle was his greatest influence and his greatest friend. Working with Arbuckle, it was hard even for Keaton to keep a straight face. In 1919, Schenck split the act. Arbuckle went into features, and Schenck bought Keaton his own studio.
In fact, he bought me Chaplin's old studio and named it the Keaton Studio. All he did as the producer says, you're to make 8 two-reelers a year. We're going to release through the new outfit called Metro.
Keaton's stardom meant $1,000 a week and 25% of the profits. But first, Schenck loaned him to Metro for this feature-length comedy, The Saphead, a stage success for Douglas Fairbanks. Metro approached Fairbanks for the lead, but he was making a film of his own.
Fairbanks says, I know who to get. He says, who? He says, Keaton. He says, well, after all, Keaton's never had anything on but misfit clothes and slap shoes all his life. But he says, you dress him up and he'll play Bertie the Lamb for you. So I did.
Co-starring with William H. Crane was the nearest thing to being on Broadway. Keaton was now an actor. This Wall Street comedy was not Keaton's style at all, but critics noticed an unusual quality. Much of it he played with a stillness which set him apart. Said Variety, his quiet work in this picture is a revelation. Back to his own studio, Keaton embarked on his first solo comedy, The High Sign. He brought in Eddie Klein as co-director. Klein, a Senate veteran, played in many of the films. At once, there was a new approach, a new way of looking at things. His frozen face became his trademark.
Got the nickname of being called Frozen Face, Blank Pan, Hole in the Donut. Oh, I had some beautiful names.
Bartine Burkett, leading lady in The High Sign, learned that the frozen face wasn't permanent.
We'd be right in the middle of a take, and he'd think of something funny, and he'd laugh and ruin the take, and we'd have to do it over again. But he laughed at everything very easily, and it was hard for him to be so solemn, you know.
spite of the complexity of the sets, the brilliance of the gags, Keaton was dissatisfied with the high sign. He took one look and rejected the film. His first release had to be far stronger. He closed the studio. He went on holiday to Lone Pine, where Arbuckle was filming, and to help him out, played a bit part as an Indian. Back in Hollywood, Arbuckle visited Keaton and his new heavy, Joe Roberts, and served as a good luck symbol to launch Keaton's first release. 1 Week was inspired by a documentary Keaton had seen. This Ford Educational showed that a newly married couple could purchase a lot and in just 7 days build a portable home from delivery to completion.
My uncle gave me the portable house, and my aunt gave me the lot to build it on as a wedding present. Only my former rival for the girl's hand changed the numbers on the crates. So when I put the house up, it was the darndest looking thing you ever saw. And then for a finish, I found out I built it on the wrong lot. I always wanted an audience to outguess me. And then I double-cross them.
One Week was hailed as the comedy sensation of the year. Audiences quickly realized that a Keaton comedy gave them more production values than any other. Yet Keaton's most remarkable effects were often the simplest. Down and out, Buster decides on suicide. However simple this may look, it took immense skill. The cameraman filmed Keaton with half the frame exposed. Then he rewound the film and exposed the other half. To keep in time, Keaton danced to music played to a metronome. With 3 Keatons in shot at once, the problems multiplied. When Keaton wanted even more, the cameraman said it can't be done, but he did it. The same piece of film exposed 9 times. Keaton and his gag men used no scripts. They thought up the gags as they went along.
And the minute we found something we liked, we says, that's a fine start. Says, now what's the finish? Well, when we found the finish, how to round that out, we never worked on the middle. We always figured the middle would take care of itself.
Keaton's thoughts had been on marriage for some time, but he was far too busy in production. Then something happened on the Electric House. Keaton's foot caught on the top of this escalator and he broke an ankle. Production stopped. While he convalesced, he made up his mind to marry Natalie Talmadge, one of the famous Talmadge sisters. Norma and Constance were stars, Natalie wasn't. The wedding took place at the Long Island home of Joe Schenck and Norma Talmadge.
I know he loved her very much, and I think she loved him very much in the beginning. But I think Peg Talmadge, the mother of the three girls, sort of wanted her married and off her hands. And since Joe Schenck made the Constance Talmadge and Norma Talmadge films and made Buster's films, that would be keeping it in the family if Natalie married Buster. But at the same time, he was a lowly comic as far as they were concerned and not all that important in the business or what they really would have liked to have had for her as a husband.
Soon, Keaton had the whole family living with him, most of them disapproving. With the sisters changed to brothers, he made this view of domestic life. In May 1921, Keaton played an innocent man falsely accused. 4 months later, his closest friend was charged with murder, with fake pictures and false accusations filling the papers. A girl had died after a party.
Everybody had their pictures in the papers for days and days and weeks, and it was headline news. W.R. Hearst told Joe Schenck in front of me, he says, this is hard to believe, but we sold more papers on the Arbuckle trial than we did on the sinking of the Lusitania.
After his third trial, the jury acquitted Arbuckle with a heartfelt apology. But the industry banished him from the screen.
Certainly was wronged. He was no more guilty of that than I was.
Arbuckle was a broken man. As the third Arbuckle trial neared its end, this was the film Keaton was making. Buster Keaton was the last of the top comedians to go into feature-length films. And when he made the decision, he did so with understandable caution. make the leap from 2-reelers to a 6-reeler, Keaton remembered Intolerance, D.W. Griffith's epic of love through the ages, which interwove 4 stories. He told his tale in 3, Stone Age, Roman, and Modern. The stories of rival suitors could be separated into 3 2-reelers if Keaton's idea proved too ambitious. It was full of 2-reeler slapstick. But it was the last such film. Keaton determined to convince his audience, as in the birth of his favorite sport.
The baseball game he was very proud of. His club was a very warped, bumpy-looking affair, and the rock that was being thrown at him was also very irregular. So it didn't go just the way Buster wanted it to go on the first take or the second take. He said finally we gave up NG in each take. We'd NG 10 at a time. He said, but on the 52nd take, it worked just the way it was supposed to, and it was worth all of the trouble. That had to hit that bat just right and go and hit the villain just right, or the gag was faked. And then he never faked the gag.
Another rule Keaton now recognized. The audience should care about the character.
We had to get sympathy to make any story stand up. But the one thing that I made sure that I didn't ask for it. If the audience wanted to feel sorry for me, that was up to them. I didn't ask for it in action.
No 2-reelers had such scale. Yet these sets are not as expensive as they look. Some were standing already, built that same year for a Hollywood exposition. Keaton's art director, Fred Gabori, transformed them into ancient Rome. Now he had the confidence to make a full-scale feature. It was also a family affair. Natalie played his leading lady. His father, Joe, came along with his famous vaudeville hitch kick. And even Keaton's baby son played in the prologue. Keaton played Willie McKay of New York, who inherits an estate in the Deep South and sets off for the long journey. In his 2-reelers, Keaton had been using more and more eccentric gags.
We lost all of that when we started making feature pictures. We had to stop doing impossible gags and what we call cartoon gags. They had to be believable, or your story wouldn't hold up.
The train was a reproduction of Stephenson's rocket, built at the Keaton studio with authentic-looking rolling stock.
And they weren't so fussy about laying railroad track. I mean, if it was a little unlevel, they just ignored it. They laid it over fallen trees, over rocks. So I got quite a few laughs trying to ride in that railroad.
Taking the baby on location had been against Natalie's wishes, but she gave in when she was made leading lady. From the start, however, she had misgivings about her role.
And towards the end of that film, she was also pregnant, carrying their second son, Bobby. And I guess before they were through with her, they were shooting her behind bushes and that sort of thing. She was getting too thick in the waist.
The location in Northern California was Keaton's favorite, Truckee, and the Truckee River played a key role in the climax of the film. Co-director Jack Blystone set his cameras at the rapids. It was here that a major accident occurred.
His cameramen were never allowed to cut until he said so. Didn't matter what happened, because something better could come out of it going wrong than what they had planned. He was in the river, and they had a holdback wire on him so that he would go at the same rate of speed that the camera was going, and you can see in the film where the wire snapped.
When we enlarge the frame, Keaton's peril becomes all the more apparent.
And that's all in the picture, because no matter what, they were not allowed to cut. If he'd have drowned, they'd have had a copy of print of the drowning. They just kept going. And he went down the rapids, over rocks, and he was half drowned with all the foam. And he finally managed to get to the edge enough to hang on to a branch of a tree, and he was totally exhausted.
An even more challenging stunt lay ahead. Far below, forest and rock add an extra dimension of danger to a stunt which may be the most hazardous Keaton has ever attempted. Buster has to rescue Natalie before she's swept over the falls herself. This stunt was staged at a specially constructed waterfall in the mountains, so it's always been thought. In fact, the entire setup was built over the swimming pool at the Keaton studio. These photographs, which have never been made public, show that the distant valley was a huge miniature, planted with tiny trees. But there was nothing faked about the stunt. Keaton needed all his courage and skill, even though we can see when we enlarge the frame that a dummy was used for Natalie. Keaton inhaled so much water a doctor had to give him first aid, and yet he could have used a double.
To my knowledge, Buster Keaton never had a double. I've heard a couple of fellows say they doubled him, but I have never seen this happen. Now, I don't believe, knowing his Buster as well as I do, and doing things as good as I used to do, I don't believe I could have done them like he wanted them. He knew what he wanted. His fall was a different fall. He just didn't slip and fall down. He'd do a lot of things before he fell down, you know? And you can't double a guy like that, doing those things.
Keaton threw himself into stunts far more dangerous than any he did on the stage. He was a first-class athlete. Even his running was impressive. Comedy for Keaton meant physical action. He not only did his own stunts, he stunted for other actors. In Sherlock Jr., he switched roles and doubled the actor playing the cop in A Dangerous Fall.
I would say, well, weren't you ever hurt in any of these things? He said, oh, he said, all the time. He said, you see this thing here on the top of my head? Well, I got that from 7 Chances. He said, you see this thing on my leg? And he pulled up his pant leg. You see this scar here? You know, I got that one from Sherlock Jr. He says, and then you see this one here? And he pulled up his shirt. Well, I got that from Battling Butler, you know. And it was something from every film on his body.
One film required a leap from one building to another. Above the 3rd Street Tunnel in Los Angeles, a set was built to give a false impression of height.
With the street below, it looked like we were up in the air about 12, 14 stories high. And I took advantage of the lid of a skylight and laid it over the edge of the roof to use as a springboard, and I didn't make it.
Keaton hit the wall before landing in the net and was badly bruised. Eddie Klein and the crew suggested changing the sequence to fit the shot. Keaton gladly agreed.
The best thing to do is to put an awning on a window, just enough to break my fall, and I can swing from that onto a rain spout. Well, it ended up as the biggest laughing sequence in the picture.
Keaton's friend, William Collier, Jr., worried so much about the risks that he acted as a kind of troubleshooter on dangerous scenes.
Well, I worked with Keaton on not all of his stunts, but some of the few stunts that each year that were dangerous. And he relied upon me to be sure that nobody was kidding around about it. There was always some comedians off the screen, you know. And he relied upon me to calm everything down and to get it down, get it right, and get him alive.
No one could have foreseen the mishap on Sherlock Jr.
The only other really bad accident he had was with the water tower. The train went out from under him. He rode the water tower down to the track. Well, he didn't realize how much force that water had, and it threw him against the railroad track with the back of his head. He had a terrible headache. I think they called off shooting for a few days anyway. And then he went back to work, and that was the end of that until about 12 or 13 years later. He went in for complete physical, x-rays and a whole lot. And the doctor said, when did you break your neck? And he said, I never broke my neck. He said, yes, you did break your neck. So he started thinking back, and he said, oh, yeah, could it have been? You know, when I knocked myself out and hit the railroad track and so forth. And the doctor says, sounds reasonable to me.
In Sherlock Jr., Buster plays detective. Here he shadows his suspect. The film faced him with a dilemma. It was full of impossible gags, and Keaton had to find a story to justify them.
Now, I laid out a few of these tricks, some of the tricks I knew from the stage. I got that batch of stuff together, and I said, I can't do it and tell a legitimate story. Because they're illusions, and some of them are clown gags, some Houdini, some Ching-Ling Foo. It's got to come in a dream. To get what we're after, got to be a projectionist in a projecting room. Once you fall asleep, you visualize yourself as one of the important characters in the picture you're showing. And go down out of that projecting room, go right down there, walk up on the screen and become a part of it. Now you tell your whole story. I think the reason we started off on that story is because I had one of the best cameramen in the picture business, Elgin Leslie. He originally was with Senate.
Leslie's task was straightforward, to begin with. The picture on the screen here is part of the theater set. lit to look like a movie. So is this. The two simply cut together. It's more complicated when the scene changes to an exterior. Now Leslie had to film screen and theatre separately on the same strip of film. To match the scenes precisely, he had to use surveyor's instruments. The picture was a success. It grossed nearly $500,000. Yet, critics said it lacked originality and ingenuity. No wonder Keaton and his gag men had a creative block when they tried to think of an idea for their next comedy. When it came by chance. A very strange chance. In 1919, alleged Bolsheviks were rounded up and deported to Russia on a ship called the Buford. In 1924, the ship was due to be scrapped when Fred Gaboury came across it in San Francisco. And Keaton chartered it for $25,000 from the shipping board. He and his gag men worked out a story centered on the liner. Foreign agents set the deserted ship adrift. But is it deserted? Two socialites are stranded aboard, each convinced they are not alone.
We finally met. Neither one has ever been in the kitchen in their lives. She wouldn't know how to make a cup of tea. He's worse. I mean, you could get two more helpless people. Well, that's all you set out to do is to survive.
Helpless or not, Buster has to learn deep-sea diving to stop the ship sinking. Keaton insisted on doing the part himself, even though diving in those days was so hazardous. The cameras also went down in a special box, submerged in Lake Tahoe, where the water was crystal clear.
One of my worst problems in Tahoe was the water. So cold that I could only stay down about 30 minutes at a time. It'd go right through you.
The cold also caused the glass panel of the camera box to mist up. Ice had to be packed around the cameramen. It took 4 weeks to complete the sequence. Drifting to the South Seas, the ship is attacked by cannibals. When the cannibals finally seize the ship, the couple take to the open sea. Keaton and his team started the Navigator without an idea. They ended it with a triumph. This was Keaton's most successful comedy. It put him with Chaplin and Harold Lloyd as one of the top 3 comedians. Yet his finest work was still to come.
Buster Keaton, A Hard Act to Follow, will continue after this brief intermission. Buster sets off for the most important journey of his life, to propose to the girl of his dreams. With the Navigator, Keaton had reached the peak of his career. Its success ensured his independence. He was known and loved all over the world, and he was rapidly becoming as wealthy as the millionaire he portrayed. Rejection was a theme which ran through many Keaton films, but at this period it was affecting his life. He was now the father of 2 boys, but Natalie kept him at a distance. She was spending at the rate of $900 a week, and that was just for clothes. They kept moving to more and more expensive homes, with money borrowed from Keaton's producer, Joseph Schenck. So when Schenck bought a story Keaton disliked, he felt obliged to do it. Buster has to marry by 7 o'clock to inherit a fortune. He'll try anybody. In desperation, Buster advertises for a bride. The response is alarming. Keaton directed this sequence with 500 women in the streets of Los Angeles. At the preview, the audience barely laughed. Keaton was dismayed. At last, something drew a belly laugh. Keaton examined the film to find out what.
Coming down the side of the hill, and there were some boulder rocks in that hill, and I hit one accidentally, sliding down that hill, on my feet most of the time. And I looked behind me in the scene, and here come 3 boulder rocks coming at me, bouncing down the hill with me, and I actually scrammed to get away from them.
The sequence faded out just as it was coming to life.
We went back, and for a finish, we built 1,500 rocks, starting from grapefruit size up to one was 8 foot in diameter. Well, I got in the middle of that rock chase, and it saved the picture for me.
Thanks to the rocks, Keaton topped the chase and dispersed the women.
The women in his films were terribly important as props, not so important as love interest. But his most beautiful leading lady he ever had was in Go West.
Go West, 7 Chances, and particularly Battling Butler, made impressive sums of money for Joseph Schenck. And in 1926, Schenck gave Keaton the go-ahead for his most expensive and spectacular production, a film called The General.
that picture, I guess, than any picture I ever made because I took an actual happening out of the Civil War, out of the history book, and I told it in detail, too. The Northerners coming in there as civilians and stealing that engine with the intent of burning bridges behind them.
The look of the film was based on Civil War photographs of Matthew Brady. Keaton told his crew, "Make it so authentic it hurts." The location was Oregon. Southern railroads were too crowded.
We bought engines up there, and with very little work, remodeled them into Civil War engines. Then we built a passenger train and a freight train on their flat cars that they had the rolling stock for us. And all the track in the world we wanted to use was already laid for us.
To Cottage Grove came 17 carloads of equipment, much of it to create this set of Marietta, Georgia. As director, Keaton was in complete control. He recreated the period so carefully that for many modern audiences, this is the Civil War brought to life. The Northern Raiders steal Buster's train and kidnap his girl, Annabelle, with Buster in hot pursuit. But he needs something more powerful than a handcar. With another engine, he discovers it.
We found that as an actual gun of the Civil War, the first railroad gun. And we duplicated that cannon. It almost looks like a prop we invented. That's the only thing that kind of scared us when the company used it. It said everybody's going to say, oh, they invented the prop just to get the gag.
The idea was to show Buster's attempts to shell the raiders on the move. Every shot had to be filmed on the move, too. But Keaton was a master of the traveling shot. Cameras were mounted on cars, themselves often mounted on railroad flat cars. This amateur film gives a rare glimpse of Keaton directing. 2 locomotives run side by side on double tracks, one pulling the camera train. The cannon has to fire its first round straight into the cab, a joke with real gunpowder.
He said, the only thing that saved our lives in that was a pair of tweezers. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the first time we loaded the cannon, we only wanted the cannonball to just go and land into the engine cab. And he said, the first time we did it, it was a good thing we was going around the curve because it went whango and it missed the car completely and landed over in a field someplace. So then we put in a little bit less, and it still went too far. He said, we finally wound up pushing the kernels of the gunpowder aside and just counting kernels into the thing. Finally got it so that when it went off, why...
Desperate to stop the raiders, Buster uses a full barrel load of powder. There was no rush on a Keaton picture. He could relax between scenes, although he looks distinctly ill at ease here, posing with the amateur photographer's wife. But you had to play baseball to work with Keaton. He'd pick up a bat at the slightest excuse and in the most unlikely places. Working without a script, Keaton liked to shoot rehearsals, as Marion Mack discovered to her cost.
When I went out that morning, I was made up and all ready to work. And I didn't know that they were going to make a scene with the water spout aimed for me, that when the train would stop, they would let me have it. But they didn't tell me they're going to do this. So the scene you see in the movie, that was quite a surprise. And I was pretty angry about it. So I let them have it.
For the Battle of Rock River, Keaton used the Oregon National Guard.
We had to have artillery pieces, army saddles, and stuff like that, and uniforms for both gray and blue. With 500 men up there, I could house them for a week and put them in gray uniforms and bring them going from right to left, and take them out, put them in blue uniforms, bring them going from left to right, and fought the war.
They issued no shoes. You had no shoes, but each guy was counted out with his uniform.
An 18-year-old private in the Oregon National Guard was John Wilson.
I do recall, though, that we had lots of caps, and we had, but the uniforms, we had about 200 of the gray and about 300 or so of the blue, and not enough to make distribution on it.
They treated us just like we were in a regular army. They had us come to attention and measure off our distance, and then they had us number off, and they gave us all our directions and what we were supposed to do, and expected us to carry it out.
The location was at Culp Creek, where a full-sized railroad bridge had been built, simply to be destroyed.
I felled the timber that made the bridge across the river to put the locomotive down. We was working for this contractor. George Potter had the job of putting the tree to build a bridge across the river that they used for that scene. 300 feet, 400 feet from here, we across the river, and it was built. And they tried it out 3 or 4 times and put the locomotive across it so that they see how it worked before they cut it so it would fall in the creek. It was about 70 feet long across from one bluff to the other.
As Jack Little's powder men laid the last of their dynamite, people came from Cottage Grove and all over the state.
I had the measles at the time, and I wasn't allowed out too much. And this was such a spectacular thing that my father says, you can't miss it, you can't miss it. It's just a one-shot deal. And so my mother decided to take me, spots and all, and I wasn't the only one with spots there either. It was quite an epidemic.
With the bridge alight, Keaton set in motion the most expensive single shot of the entire silent era. People in the crowd screamed. Someone was on that engine.
It had a white shirt, as well as I remember, and a vest, and his cap.
By enlarging the frame, we can see what alarmed the crowd.
One of the ladies fainted because this dummy leaned forward, and we all thought it looked like a real person in there. And when the train went down then, it had a whistle on it, a very shrill whistle. It was kind of a mournful thing, and everybody felt like something really had happened that was really dreadful.
The battle was covered by 6 cameras.
It was very exciting and a little bit alarming because there were shells going off and they had explosions going off, and they blew parts of trees to pieces, and the horses had riders on them that weren't the greatest riders in the world, and some of them were falling off, and I know it was kind of scary as far as I was concerned.
But the funny part, going down the hill, I happened to be a little bit in the rear, and they had stakes out there where they had smoke bombs or explosives of some kind, and someone had I've forgotten how they designated who would die and who wouldn't. But somebody would fall to this stake, and he'd look at that stake, and he'd crawl like the devil to get away from it.
There were some of them would be thrown off of the cannons, and the horses was running wild, and they'd get run over, and it was next thing to a war.
And they had it dammed at this end to make more water. And it was supposed to be wadeable, but it wasn't.
Water wasn't just knee deep, it went clear over my head. They said it was 18, 20 feet deep, the hole where I stepped into. And I swam. The water was much more of a river here. And I turned around, I swam right back out into the big hole. And there's where I went down 3 times.
I don't know how many of them almost drowned in there. We kept pulling them out for 10 minutes, I guess.
Keaton was ultimately responsible for everything that happened, but he shared the risks. 9 men had been injured, several by explosions.
One of them was too close to Buster Keaton, and it knocked him over and knocked him unconscious. And he lay there on the ground for quite some time unconscious. They finally brought him to, and he rested up a while and got back on the job.
Then the unbelievable happened. Like one Keaton climax topped by another, sparks from the engine set fire to tinder-dry forest. Every man was rushed to the scene.
And there was a lot of young fellows that was there that had no experience whatsoever in fighting a fire. Well, they thought all you had to do was just go up there and start in and fight it. And Buster himself, he took his pants off, and he was as fresh as with his pants.
He'd been fighting the fire with these pants while the rest of the men had been using their uniforms. So he would run around in long shorts with the back down. And at that time he had a pitchfork, and he was sneaking up on a little puff of smoke and putting it out. And of course everybody was just hilarious.
They got the fire out with no trouble, but there was so much smoke that they couldn't shoot. And they had to wait for a rain to come and clear out the smoke. Well, that could be up to 6 weeks or 7 weeks or whenever. So they had to pack the whole thing in and come back to LA and wait for a rain. And then when they finally got a rainstorm and that cleared the smoke out, then they went back up and finished the picture. So that drove the budget up considerably.
Keaton was already wildly over budget, but he had produced what he and his associates were convinced was his masterpiece. Modern audiences agree, but when the film opened in New York, reviews were mixed. A few were positive, but the New York Times said, "This is by no means as good as Mr. Keaton's previous efforts." Variety, "The General is far from funny." Life magazine, "Many of his gags are in gruesomely bad taste." Keaton's favorite picture did not cover its costs. Schenck insisted that in future he work with a production supervisor. The supervisor, Harry Brand, had a profound effect on Steamboat Bill Jr. Keaton was preparing to flood the Mississippi at his specially built location at Sacramento, California, when a real-life disaster intervened. Harry Brand had seen these newsreels of the real Mississippi floods and alerted Joe Schenck. Keaton was working with director Charles Reisner. He was almost ready to shoot.
I said, "I've already built my sets, and our gags are worked out." He says, "All I could do is change it to a cyclone, which will take a lot of rebuilding." I said, "Well, that's better. Do that."
They rebuilt. A dredger crane was used to tear buildings from their moorings. Aeroplane engines provided the cyclone. As Keaton became more enthusiastic about the idea, the gags became even more elaborate. Cables linked a light breakaway set to a cantilever. The slightest touch could lift it.
And then they had that famous scene where Buster is standing in the street, and the whole front of a building comes off and crashes down, and he's standing right under it. One of the most spectacular stunts ever done. Of course, it was very dangerous.
Ropes hauled the wall into position.
The whole front of the building was on a base plate and on hinges.
The ropes were cut simultaneously. Behind the window, you can just glimpse a man retreating after giving the set a final push.
It must have weighed 1,000 pounds, the damn thing. And if Buster was 6 inches out of position one way or the other, they would have driven him right into the ground like a little tent peg, you know. Poor Buster was gone, and my father, who was a very religious man, he had a lot of different religions, but at this time he happened to be a Christian Scientist, and he had a practitioner up there. And they were praying all day because here comes this shot, you know, and he couldn't, my father couldn't bear to see it. He and the practitioner were off praying in one corner, and you know, they had to wait until to find out whether Buster came through it or not. He was a game little guy, that Buster.
Just before Buster made the shot, came news from Skank that would mean the end of his creative freedom.
He had been arbitrarily turned over to MGM. He was having problems at home, one thing and another. And he had reached the point where he really didn't care that much